to introduce our two speakers. First of all, thank you for coming here for what promises to be a lively and informative discussion about a topic that is growing in importance. Our first speaker will be Elizabeth Rosenberg, who is a senior fellow and director of Energy, Economics and Security Program at the Center for New American Security. She has also served for a number of years during the Obama administration in the Treasury Department. And last but not least, she is also, like me, a graduate of Oberlin College, known as an OB. Our second speaker will be David Dollar, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, who also worked at the World Bank for a number of 20 years, I think. And we will follow our usual format. Each speaker will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then we will proceed to a vigorous audience discussion. Elizabeth?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just tell me if I need to adjust these so that you can all hear me, or if everything's okay. Great. Thank you for that kind introduction. Always excellent to be with a fellow OB. It's all too rare. I think, as a spoiler at the top, I'm not going to speak for that entire time, so as not to lull you into being less than vigorous. Did you say vigorous in our conversation? I had a couple of prompts for what to talk about, and I'm going to talk through two general things. And apologies to any of you for whom this is already something you know well, but maybe my interpretation of why sanctions are an important instrument of financial power will provoke you to challenge what I'm putting forward, and we can have our vigorous conversation. So first I want to talk a little bit about sanctions as this powerful tool of U.S. Economic statecraft and financial power, and a little bit about circumvention specifically, which will tee up a great set of remarks, I no doubt, about China in particular. So first, it's no surprise to any of us that sanctions are a tool of first resort when it comes to foreign policy and national security policy. They're certainly a favorite for this administration. That may also be true of the last administration, but this one even more so. And of course, they address an array of different top national security and foreign policy issues. Some of the primary ones we can think about here include counterterrorism interests, addressing proliferation, pushing back against Iran on the basis of a number of different concerns, North Korea, sanctions against an array of Russian activities, Venezuela, Myanmar, there are others. In the earlier iterations of sanctions, we know about the Cuba and Iraq, the South Africa cases, the kingpin authorities going after narco traffickers. And you all know well that South Africa is often raised up as a great success in the use of this policy, and others, including Cuba and Iraq, are often remembered and discussed with somewhat less success. Now, even in the last couple of years, there are an array of new security challenges for which sanctions are being called upon to address. And those include things like transnational organized crime, for human rights abuses. There's been iterations of use of sanctions for human rights in the past, but it's a much more a common occurrence in the last couple of years with authorities and designations. Malicious cyber activity, including cyber-enabled IP theft or other damaging commercial activity, election interference, new sanctions against Nicaragua. You may have seen the sanctions proposed against Chinese fentanyl. It goes on and on. So there are even an array of, here's sort of to set you up a little bit for later, new ideas, creative ideas about how to go after Chinese political activity, commercial activity, relations with the United States. The Wall Street Journal, I believe, has offered a couple of, and others have offered articles over the last year as the administration seems to have been close, but not yet there, across the finish line, using IEEPA-based sanctions. Authorities to keep Huawei and ZTE, for example, Chinese telecoms out of the United States, and new creative ways to go after Chinese entities in particular for Iran and North Korea sanctions, possibly even Venezuela sanctions, violations, and others. So what's the power of these sanctions? Why do they have leverage? Why is this such a prominent tool? Early in the days of sanctions, some of those earlier programs, the Cuba, the Iraq, we were talking about a model that was based on leveraging the prominence of the United States in international trade, both its role in supply chains and as a major party in so many international trade transactions. A challenge you may be quite familiar with is that they were pretty leaky. There was tremendous opportunity for exploitation and circumvention if they're anything but utterly multilateral. And there were unfortunate incidences of corruption and humanitarian crisis that were well documented, particularly in the Iraq case. Learning from those examples, there was an iteration and succession in the way that these tools were formulated and used about 15 years ago, a shift to what many people called smart sanctions, going after financial transactions. So instead of looking at the trade relations, instead looking at the money moving associated with certain kinds of trade or services. And that has been so powerful because the United States is such a central player in the global banking system, both in terms of the store of value, so the dollar as a unit and store of value, and also as a currency for transactions, trade transactions and wires. And after the financial crisis in the last decade, actually that strength and centrality has been even more concentrated, which supercharges this authority. And now it's pretty clear that no global bank or company will risk its access to the dollar, to the United States financial system, to its ability to clear dollars by violating these sanctions. They are tremendously deterred by the enforcement penalties in the billions of dollars. And some of these foreign banks and companies have even moved their compliance departments into the United States, which is an extraordinary step for a foreign company and bank. In the last 5 to 7 years, I would say, there's been another interesting adaptation. And this is one reason why we should always bear in mind that sanctions are far from one particular instrument that functions in one particular way. In fact, it's really just a proxy name or moniker that describes a whole array of different kind of banking restrictions or restrictions on different banking functions. And that is the iteration where now sanctions can be used to go after, to be much more micro-targeted, to go after just an individual instead of the entire institution they run, such as Sechin or Lexi Miller, for example, not their companies, or a kind of financial activity, a class of financial transactions, dealings in servicing debt, sovereign bonds, etc. And that has made it particularly possible to go after bigger targets or bigger economies or bigger companies. So let us just set aside the notion of something that is too big to fail. That doesn't exist in the sanctions world because there is an ability to go after individuals or smaller offices. So don't let that confuse you or anyone you know about whether this tool may be exploited to go after biggest financial institutions or national governments. Another interesting innovation has been those enormous fines that I mentioned, and they have been used not only to be a bigger and bigger brushback or deterrent to those who would violate U.S. sanctions, but also they've served to educate and be a wake-up call to entire economic sectors or countries that weren't really aware or were loosely aware of what these tools were. So thinking about the first ZTE, the enforcement actions on ZTE was an enormous wake-up call for entities in China and all over East Asia, that there were these things called U.S. trade controls that they had to concern themselves with or face, as ZTE did, at least until Trump failed them out. insolvency potentially. So in business units. So the last thing I would just say in this most contemporary iteration, and we see this every day all the time, but in a political era where there's a willingness to engage in very disruptive economic policy that has collateral damage, then you can really, take your gloves off and do what you will with sanctions. They can have enormous consequences. It's really much of the Trump brand to be the sort of smash and burn economic policy, which I'd be delighted to talk more about with all of you. And it pairs pretty well with a strong sense of nationalism, right? If you care less about your allies and multilateralism, then you can really target your allies as the wedge to going after a bigger, greater competition. So I will just note, but I'm not going to go into it, that there is, of course, a robust conversation about the success or lack of success of this tool. And I want to try and cut that conversation short by saying that it's really impractical to spend too much time. Yes, we should, and it's an important academic pursuit. But if we in Washington are co-located with so many policymakers, it may be impractical to argue should we or shouldn't we, because they are here to stay. The genie is out of the bottle. Arguing restraint has zero political salience. And so what is more appropriate to do is to think about the criteria for successful use, or how to pair these instruments with other tools, and to try and stay focused on that kind of conversation, lest we diminish the credibility of this conversation. On circumvention, let me just say a couple of things and then move on. I see your eyes are all awake, so your eyes are open, everyone's awake. That's good so far, right after lunch. But in circumvention, let's think about this in two ways. There's the discrete forms of circumvention of particular sanctions, and then there's a broader effort to, at a more systemic level, isolate targets from not just a particular sanction, but also the source of US economic strength or connectivity to the US economic system, that strength that underpins the sanctions. At that discrete level of a particular sanction, we could talk for days and days about this. And in fact, it makes good sense for many financial institutions or companies that have to comply with these sanctions to do that, because there are so many ways to circumvent them. Just in 2 seconds, I will say, some people are blatant in the way that they do it. They're using social media or their networks to put out the word that they're happy to facilitate violation. Many people are more discreet. They're using barter, front companies, false aliases or false identities, trusted agents. They turn off their transponders on ships. They engage in ship-to-ship transfer in international waters where it's really hard to go after them for enforcement. Using cryptocurrencies, going to jurisdictions where there's less transparency about beneficial owners for companies, or scrutiny for financial services activity more generally. The takeaway that I want to offer about that is that if there's an incentive to cheat, and there always will be, then there will be cheating. So let's just set that aside. And also, the biggest international players that do have to care about their reputation, they have shareholders, for example, or they have ambitious business plans that involve them being perceived as a reputable, law-abiding company, and they need access to the dollar, they will abide by these sanctions. And frankly, that involves every global company, all big regional companies. So what's left are smaller institutions, which may nevertheless be able to conduct some meaningful activity, but they're not the biggest ones. And in our heavily interdependent and financially connected world, of course, that does mean that an institution will have to be relatively small in order to be the kind that will want to violate sanctions and risk that exposure. I will refrain from offering you some specific examples of people who are trying to both evade the discrete ones and the more systemic level, but just say, more systemically, this includes the INSTEX, the UK, France, Germany, non-bank mechanism, value transfer mechanism to try and facilitate Iranian transactions with initially at least European entities, but perhaps eventually others, initially humanitarian goods, which aren't covered by sanctions anyway, but and there's also Chinese payment messaging systems and a Russian counterpart that are all designed to be US sanctions resistant. The spoiler here is that they're not, which is one of the reasons why the Europeans have only targeted or initially targeted non-sanctioned activity. And let me just end with one particular point, which is that sanctions violators won't be the main driver behind an alternative payment system or currency or sanctions resistant mechanism or platform for evading US jurisdiction. There's just too much inefficiency and problem with scaling for that to really get off the ground. I mean, that kind of environment can be and has been excellent for criminals and smaller, I think of sort of the kiddie porn industry or counterfeit cigarettes, et cetera. There's big business in smaller universes of that kind of law violation. But there are other economic interests, and it will have to be a true economic interest that finds true economic efficiency. I mean, I think any behavioral economist will tell you it has to involve some measure of centralization and transparency and economic efficiency for people to really truly launch an alternative currency or not launch a currency, possibly lift up an existing currency such as the euro or launch an alternative payment system that can truly succeed and scale, which means that sanctions violators may be the happy bandwagoners on this. It's possible that that could happen, but they won't be the drivers. So I think I will just stop. I'll stop there, but I don't want to stop without saying one last thing, which is the potential for that to happen, for someone to truly evade sanctions by promoting the euro or the renminbi, possibly through new sources, through new flows of currency, such as in Belt and Road and project economic development and the financial flows associated with them. It is possible that this can happen. It would be tremendously consequential for the United States and for China or for Europe. It doesn't look like that's happening anytime in the near future. So the takeaway on that is that whether we like it or not, there's a lot of running room for the use of US sanctions. That may be exciting or scary, depending on how you look at that. So sorry. But it is something that could happen in the future, which is why we should pay close attention to it. It won't be the only source of, it's not the only source of US strength, the role of the dollar. There's many other significant economic factors which have to do with the United States being economically prominent, but this is a really important one to watch.
Thank you.
Okay.
We'll now turn to David.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was asked to talk about Chinese perspectives on US sanctions and the issue of the internationalization of the Chinese currency, the renminbi or the RMB. The two-sentence version of my talk is that the Chinese hate unilateral US sanctions, but cannot really do anything about it in the short run or even in the foreseeable future. And the second sentence is internationalization of the RMB is a long way off. It's a long-term program. So let me elaborate on each of these. First, the Chinese hate the unilateral sanctions. They recognize that the United States is the leader of the global economic order. And I've been privileged to sit on meetings with Xi Jinping, other Chinese leaders. You know, I represented the US Treasury in Beijing. So when I go to a meeting, it's with the Treasury Secretary or someone like that. So the topics are economic. And Xi Jinping started one meeting with Jack Lew by saying, you know, the United States set up the international economic order after World War II. We support that. We've benefited from it. You know, we're a good citizen supporting that. And, you know, take it with a little skepticism, but there's part of it that's certainly true is that China recognizes the power of the global economic system, and also that they've benefited enormously. They're arguably the country that's benefited the most. But then they feel that the United States has a responsibility to use the power inherent in that, you know, carefully. And so they hate it when the US does unilateral things. very much agree with Elizabeth that our financial sanctions are a very, very powerful tool. And the issue is not payments. It's very easy to work around the payment system, in my view. The issue is that any large-scale transaction, our intelligence community can identify any significant firm that's involved in these transactions, a firm or a bank, can be identified, can be sanctioned. And as Elizabeth said, you know, all those big Chinese banks are expanding into the United States. They don't want to be sanctioned and put out of business dealing with the United States financial system. So it's a very powerful tool. And I would point out that during the time I was representing Treasury in the US Embassy in Beijing, there were a couple of good examples of China cooperating well with us on financial sanctions that obviously were not just unilateral, because we were trying to get China to cooperate. I would cite the more recent example, which is beyond my own time, but I think the recent example of DPRK is telling. You know, the Chinese were pretty alarmed at various things that Kim Jong-un was doing over the last few years, nuclear and missile testing, and he clearly had pretty hostile relations with China. So China cooperated with the US in tightening financial sanctions on North Korea, that were obviously endorsed by the United Nations. So that's the kind of operation the Chinese like. Let's go through the United Nations. And I think they honored those sanctions pretty well, squeezed North Korea, and then that brought North Korea to the negotiating table. More recently, I think the Chinese are unhappy about the stalemate in US-North Korea discussions. So you can probably detect a weakening of sanctions on the Chinese part. And I also agree with Elizabeth that you can always get some small firms working around these sanctions. And North Korea is a small economy, so it may be relatively important to have a little bit of activity around the size of these sanctions. The other example I would cite is Iran. There I was involved as a fly on the wall, I would say. And in my experience was that China cooperated pretty well with the Obama administration in reducing its purchases of oil from Iran and being part of a multilateral coalition to squeeze Iran and get the United Nations deal. And that's, I think, oil from Iran is a good example of kind of what's inherently a big transaction. There can be a little bit of small activity on the side, but for Iran to make any serious money, you're going to need tankers. It's going to be easy to identify what firms are involved. And so China cooperated in the financial sanctions against Iran. Now they're extremely unhappy that the US has walked away from the UN deal and is going back to unilateral sanctions. And then just the announcement this week is that we expect all our partners to go to zero very quickly. China has cleverly diversified its sources. It gets about 6% of its oil from Iran. It's not overwhelming, but it's 6% of a very, very big number. So it's not that easy for China to switch very quickly. And all of this is pushing up the price of oil. China is the biggest importer of oil in the world. So this is costing them. So you probably saw their Ministry of Foreign Affairs had a pretty hostile statement that was characterized in the press as China blasts the United States for the unilateral sanctions. But I read the statement as being carefully crafted to leave China's options open. We're involved in a difficult trade negotiation at the moment. So China's in a very tough spot. And a couple things that we both said about big firms really do not want to be frozen out of the US market. I think that's going to be operative here. So I don't know for sure what the outcome will be. Probably the Chinese will ask President Trump for some kind of waiver. Maybe they'll agree to cut their purchases in half if they could get a waiver and have this done legally. I suspect their imports won't go to zero. If the US plays hardball, there'll probably be a little bit of activity outside of the sanctions. China has some smaller banks and smaller oil companies that might be involved. But I stand by the point that if we play hardball, then China will have to cut back on major purchases. I just don't see their firms taking the chance, and I also don't see the government of China wanting to really antagonize the Trump administration at this critical moment. Now, the second topic I wanted to take up is the whole issue of internationalization of the Chinese currency. And there's a large academic literature on what is the foundation of a reserve currency or currency that's seriously used in international exchange. One aspect is of having a big GDP and a big trading presence. So China obviously meets that standard. It's the biggest trading nation. It's the second biggest economy. By 2030, it'll probably be the biggest economy in the world. But that same literature identifies a whole host of other factors that are relevant for being a major international currency. Factors such as deep capital markets, open capital account, flexible currency, and your basic rule of law and property rights. And I think all of this is very intuitive. If people don't hold dollars as reserves because they particularly like us, right? They hold dollars as reserves because we have very good property rights. We have an open capital account. We have very deep capital markets. You'll see data suggesting that some reserves are held in euros and other currencies. I think at the moment, 62% of global reserves are in dollars. And that's actually the same figure as in 1979. So there's no long-term trend for the dollar to decline that we've witnessed over the last 40, 50 years. But I often say half jokingly that the dollar is really the only reserve currency, because while central banks who have a lot of reserves like to diversify a bit, if there's a crisis and you look at what do they actually use, they only use dollars, right? Because in the crisis, the dollar tends to appreciate. Euro in the most recent, when we had the 2008 crisis, the euro depreciated initially. The smart move is to use dollars, plus we have those deep capital markets. So what does it mean? You're holding bonds, you actually need cash. You can always go into the US markets and sell your bonds for cash. That's what it means to have deep markets. So I just think our fundamentals at the heart of the dollar being the dominant reserve currency in the world, I just don't, hopefully we're not going to erode our fundamentals. And then I don't see China building up that kind of track record for a long time. China's created some problems in this whole agenda. They've had a big boom of credit over the last few years, creating this big liquidity overhang. So they've tightened up their capital controls. It would be, the IMF is normally encouraging countries to open up, is telling China to be very cautious about opening the capital account, because probably the first thing that would happen is a lot of capital would flow out and the currency would depreciate perhaps very significantly, and that would be damaging for the Chinese and the world economy. So it's hard for them to open their capital account. Their capital markets are not very deep. Foreign investors do not have reliance, they do not have confidence that they can just go into China and buy different assets and then sell them and then take the money out. So all the conditions that you need to really have a major reserve currency are not in place, probably are not going to be in place for a long time to come. So just in conclusion, I would, I'm proud of my name dollar, and I think it will continue to be in ascendancy for a long time to come, though of course that does depend a lot on us preserving all the things that are the foundation of a reserve currency. It does give us exorbitant power. I'm personally a little bit worried that we're a little too quick to use this powerful weapon. In terms of, I haven't talked at all about what objectives, what are results of using these. My instinct is that when we work with partners, and I gave a couple of examples, these can be powerful tools, and the world understands that we're using them in a particular way. When we go unilateral, there tends to be less support. I think they're probably less successful, though. I think if we play hardball in Iran, we're going to make the sanctions do what we want the sanctions to do, but we are gradually eroding confidence in the overall system. But having said that, I don't expect China to be able to capitalize on that quickly anytime soon for the reasons I said. So I think China is definitely stuck in a difficult place. They hate the unilateral sanctions. They're probably going to have to largely go along with what we want to do on Iran. Thank you.
Wow, those were two excellent presentations. And I think I'll just quickly kick off the discussion with a question. Both of you touched upon, but didn't really spell out, what are the political implications of the United States increasingly resorting to sanctions. Sanctions used to be, in my memory, much more controversial when the United States used to apply them. For example, there was a huge debate about South Africa. And many conservatives at that time, the Wall Street Journal op-ed page was filled with pieces saying that America was using sanctions too promiscuously and that this was a bad road to go down. Here we are now. The Obama administration clearly created or really helped to create an arsenal of sanctions weapons. And now the Trump administration is firing them. So what are the political implications? Is this bad for the United States? Is this a bad thing that we're using them so frequently now?
I would add that this administration isn't just firing them, they're creating more too. So is it bad? Well, that is a great question because the answer is totally subjective. So is it bad? I expect that most of us would say, this is terrible. This is all kinds of negative consequences that will come back to haunt the United States in the near and long term. Our allies are spurned and angry and now motivated to figure out ways to try and distance themselves. They have less trust in the United States. We have less credibility. It's going to be harder for the United States to ask them to join with the United States to address joint security concerns on everything from even the things we all care a lot about, such as Venezuela, Syria, counterterrorism issues, things that we all, Iran, amongst others, China, like a competition with strategic and economic competition with China, and on and on and on. And where it should be easier to work together, it's difficult because of the chilliness of the relations, and sanctions are not the only reason. So it's a little hard to separate out this driver from the damage to these relations that threatening tariffs, from withdrawing from the JCPOA, from withdrawing from the Paris process, climate process, et cetera. There's saying terrible, damaging things about the utility of NATO and questioning whether the United States would indeed feel obliged to comply with its NATO commitments for mutual defense, et cetera. So, but this is one important source of factor in diminishing these strong relationships of trust. But given the reasons that we've just walked through about the fact that for now and probably for at least the next decade and maybe longer, we're all stuck in this international financial system where the United States has created and manages the pipes of this financial system. If you want to play, you grudgingly, angrily, you must comply. And for everyone of any meaningful size, that will hold true. I think it probably accelerates a variety of forms of creative forms of efforts to try and find alternative ways to do business and create security partnerships. And we see this in a bunch of different arenas, but through the midterm, where the United States, I fear, is learning the lesson that you can do this and still have tremendous economic and strategic dominance. And not until we learn the lesson far too late that global AI and cyber capabilities have completely passed the United States by, or someone really does launch a successful alternative payments universe that manages to be sanctions resistant, et cetera, that we'll find out only then and take course correcting policy action only then. But that's at this point a hypothetical, and in the far into the intermediate or the midterm future.
I would just add that there are a number of efforts to create alternative payment systems. The Europeans are trying to do something with Iran. Russia has a system, China. I view all of these as pathetic. And this is essentially just revealing to the world how powerful the US financial system is. And it comes back to a point that we both made, that the issue isn't really about payments. You know, if Iran and China want to trade stuff, they can work that outside of the payment system. It's that if we can identify the Chinese firms involved and we sanction them, any significant firm cannot afford to be cut off from the US financial market. Even if they have no business with the United States in some sense, all dollar transactions go through New York. I forgot to mention one other thing that should have been part of my initial set piece, because you, Elizabeth, mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. They're having their big forum in Beijing right now. So you might have the impression that China's lending a lot of renminbi and this is going to build up the renminbi as a global currency. They're actually lending in dollars. Almost none of the lending is in RMB because it's not an international currency. So what does it mean to be indebted in RMB? What are you going to do? So most of these loans are in dollars or euros, and it's just digging China deeper and deeper, into the global financial system. So that's really her power.
So our first question, we have a number of people, I'll get you all in order, is from Ambassador Richard Burt.
So both of you have talked about the dominance of the U.S. financial system and which has led to this focus on the use of sanctions. I guess there are kind of three issues, though, that I think need to be addressed, in my view. The first is whether maybe we possess this financial dominance, but in using it as we have, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, has that been a net plus for U.S. foreign policy and furthering U.S. national interests, or has it been a minus? And I would argue it's probably hurt us the way we've used sanctions. It's hurt us more than it's helped us. For example, I'm really hard pressed to see a real success, a recent success of U.S. sanctions policy. Now, people say that the fact that the EU and the United States have been able to keep their sanctions in place in the aftermath of Russian intervention in Ukraine and Crimea is a success. But in fact, it's not. We kept the sanctions in place, but we haven't changed Russian policy. Russians are still in the eastern Ukraine. The Russians are not going to move out of Crimea. So I don't see the success. Now, the one area where you could point to recently in terms of sanctions policy that was a success was the very limited and short-term use of sanctions during the Obama administration to apply leverage on Iran to negotiate the JCPOA. Once we got that agreement, those sanctions were lifted until the Trump administration came back and unilaterally withdrew from that agreement. Now ask yourself, if you got a new administration that said, we want to pursue an approach similar to the one that we pursued with Iran, this short-term multilateral effort, how many of those countries like the British, French, Germans, Chinese, and Russians would join us in that effort after what we've done in Iran? So I don't see foreign policy success flowing from sanctions. Secondly, neither one of you have mentioned the Congress. And what the Congress has done, and Elizabeth talked about using IEPA, the president's executive authority. Well, the Congress, as you probably know, and all the sanctions that were put in place by the Obama administration in the case of Ukraine have now become law incorporated in CAATSA. So they are all now laws. And I will remind you of Jackson-Vanik. Jackson-Vanik was put in place by the U.S. Congress in 1972, and it was all predicated on Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but Jackson-Vanik was in place until 2006. So getting the U.S. Congress to lift sanctions and to have a flexible foreign policy tool is practically impossible. And nobody loves sanctions more than the Congress because it's probably the only instrument Congress can use to make foreign policy. And I guess my last point would be simply this. I'm not an economist, so you're probably right that there isn't a short-term workaround for the Chinese or the Europeans or others to dependence on the dollar. But if that dependence is going to remain, inevitably for political reasons, they are going to find other ways to stymie what we want to achieve. There are going to be political costs, whether it's in terms of our ability to work closely with the EU on a whole range of trade issues or other issues with our closest allies. So while I agree with the argument you've made about the dominance, I see it as in the long term very counterproductive for U.S. national security.
Wow. Elizabeth?
Sure. These are great questions. I appreciate where you've taken this conversation to begin with on the issue of pluses or minuses. You have beautifully illustrated what is and should be a robust conversation about, does this work, in what instance, how should it work? And though it will mean more competition for me and my program at my think tank, we should have a lot more people talking about this. And I value what you've said here. It is true that I think in the last, you gave it a 5-year time period. That's great for the sake of a conversation like such as this one. Many people do credit the financial pressure, which was multilateral, on Iran for having teed the Iranian regime up for a conversation for nuclear diplomacy to arrive upon the JCPOA. I think even for the people who, whether you like the JCPOA or not, many people, near majority, share that view. As far as what, failures or net minuses, I would say the jury is out. So I would like to credit this administration with the maximum financial pressure applied on North Korea, which did budge the North Koreans into engaging to, and also it's the president's willingness to engage in summit diplomacy. But that did move this conversation forward. What all we think about the capacity or success of managing the diplomatic side to what comes next is, I would say that's a different conversation, but the economic pressure, and this significantly engendered by China's participation and enforcement of these sanctions, that did make an economic difference for North Korea. And the United States both helped engineer UN Security Council sanctions as well as US sanctions. So I saw some shaking heads out there, so I'm sure there's people who disagree. On Venezuela, I think I am deeply concerned about where this set of Venezuela sanctions leads. It feels to me directionless and meandering. However, there is enormous support all over the world for very tough economic pressure applied on the Maduro regime, the OAS, many European states, a number of US constituencies are extremely supportive of this strangulation effort, maybe, coup by sanctions, or not coup, a regime change by sanctions approach. Sorry, I misspeak here. If you are, people also seem to love the Magnitsky, global Magnitsky set of sanctions for people who have long been talking about humanitarian atrocities and political corruption, who want to call out regimes, not just in Russia, but all of Eastern Europe, Latin America, Africa. This is a welcome set of slightly more muscular instruments in order to create consequences and expose particular egregious violators of human rights and those who engage in corruption. So I have plenty of my own opinions beyond that, but I will just say I think there's a robust debate about the pluses or minuses, which is a really good thing. It is a little ironic I didn't mention Congress because I feel like I spend at least half of my time talking about Congress and talking to Congress and offering my opinions, whether they take them or not. I think what you were implying was, which I would certainly agree with, which that they've been an essential, formidable influencer, shaping the narrative around sanctions, creating authorities, codifying a number of authorities. There's some more that I would like to codify, such as the election interference EO that they have not yet done, but I would like to see them do that and conduct oversight for the administration in order to address that issue, which the Mueller report, I will just say, seems to affirm again and again. On the last issue about the response from China, they may be stuck with these sanctions and the ability of the United States to use them. Did you say that in the South Africa case, the promiscuous use?
Yeah.
Let's revive that. Anyway, that powerful phrasing, but there will be response, and China has its own set of coercive tools that they have used over the last decade, that they have increasingly used over the last year or two, that I think that they will engage in further use of, not just for U.S. allies and partners, but more directly towards the United States. And I've had the pleasure of chatting with some of you before about this particular issue, on which we run a research project at my organization, and I think some of you all do as well. This concerns me significantly, and I think it will be a major source of or aspect of the competition between the United States and China going forward.
Want to add any?
I think we should take more questions.
Okay, Mike Lehos was next.
No world system lasts forever. Now, you've compellingly laid out and portrayed how much sanctions serve as an instrument of U.S. power in dominating the system. But of course, they're also an expression, kind of representation of the majesty of U.S. Power. And there is a strategic competition. We bandy that little term of art around all the time. And there's lots and lots of roiling under the surface in the system. You talked about ways to get around U.S. sanctions. And you could also come up, I suppose, with insurgent practices. But what fundamentally would have to change in the current system? And I'm not talking about you're providing a forecast or prognostication, anything like that. Not what will happen, but rather what would have to happen to the current world system for sanctions no longer to work the way they do for the U.S. And I want to put it that way rather than talk about, well, how could the world system the U.S. dominates come apart? I don't want to get into apocalyptic visions, but rather just what would have to change to what exists now for this whole sanctions world no longer to work?
Well, first, I have some sympathy with the comment. I didn't really address the issue of do the sanctions work in the sense of meeting U.S. objectives. I was focused more on the kind of economic financial side. So, it's sort of thinking about why the sanctions might not work in the future. One option would be for the United States to choose to go down a different road, right? And I think it's, for the moment, I think it's hard for China and Iran, anyone else, to get around these things in a very meaningful way. But I'm sympathetic to the idea that we're eroding our alliances where we have alliances. It's going to be harder for us to address global goods like climate change and public health and development. So we may decide to pull back because they're effective in some narrow sense, but they're not actually meeting their objective. But then also, then to answer, I think was probably more your question, is kind of what would be a state of the world where the U.S. wouldn't have that power anymore? And it would have to, I think China is the only realistic case for developing, a competing system with the United States. But I'm a big fan of capitalism in our system. So they would have to move a lot toward capitalism, private property rights, freedom, deep capital markets. I don't see them creating an authoritarian alternative to the U.S. financial system. And as I indicated, I think it's pretty far down the road. Europe, ironically, on paper, looks like it could be a financial competitor to the U.S., but they actually don't have deep capital markets, partly because they still are they are still different countries. A bunch of them may issue bonds in euros, but it's not one product traded in one market. So there's not a large, liquid, deep European bond market. And, without more political integration, it's really hard to see Europe being that kind of serious competitor. So I don't know any economist who thinks, any of these players are going to be serious competitors with the U.S. financial system, say within the next 20 years.
That's helpful. That means that they'd have to become more like the US in its approach and also in its institutional and.
Right, but that's clearly my view. I just don't think China's created a superior system. I think they've created a hybrid system that's gotten them from poverty to middle income, but I don't see them, becoming on a per capita basis a dominant force in the world. They have 4 times as many people, so they're going to end up being a really, really big economy that we have to deal with.
We have a question from Henry Farrell, who forms part of a deadly duo in the latest issue of the National Interest, a story that's getting a lot of attention called Money Moves on the issue of U.S. financial power. So I felt obligated to warn our panelists that Henry and Abraham are here today.
Okay, so 3 questions, but they're all pretty short. 2 for Elizabeth. First of all, you suggest that there isn't all that much in the way of strategic reason for the U.S. to pull back on sanctions. So I'm wondering if you could talk through a little bit, this was after your time in Treasury, but what the logic might have been behind the decision to pull back on the Rusal Deripaska sanctions to make them much more personally linked, and why it is that the sanctions were clarified in ways that perhaps rolled them back substantially. Second, I'm also wondering if we think about big corporate players as being an important part of this and that they have an incentive to continue to stay in the system, what kinds of implications might stuff like the Title III of Helms-Burton and the exposure to possible very unpredictable private actions in U.S. courts, what kinds of implications might that have for the willingness of big corporate players to stay within the U.S. financial system? I guess for David, my question is, if this is not so much about payment systems, and it's pretty clear, U.S. intelligence can identify this, what is the legal basis on which the U.S. could pursue sanctions if they weren't in dollars and there wasn't another obvious U.S. nexus for those kinds of trades?
All right, we should answer these briefly because we have a ton of questions coming up.
So your first question, I did not mean to say there's no strategic reason to pull back. I think there are many strategic reasons to pull back. I just don't think there's the political salience, unfortunately. The decision to pull back or to delist Rusal and 2 other Deripaska companies. So the Treasury Department, OFAC specifically, created this 50% rule. It's sort of one of the only bright lines that exists in sanctions compliance world. And so they stuck to it, which means they're stuck with the scenario where if, as Deripaska did, he divests himself below 50% of these companies, then they shall be free. They can demonstrate that, then they shall be free from designations, removed from the list. And in fact, I think this Treasury Department and OFAC felt like it was a triumph to not just have engineered a situation where he divested below that amount for these 3 companies, which all included, but also agreed to other conditions, which they thought went over and above what is necessary for delisting, which is a legal matter, is true. So inspections, or the equivalent of inspections and verifications, right? So they made decisions about changing the nature of their board, about ongoing representations and oversight to which they would submit going forward. As you can see from the politics of this, that went over like a load of bricks. Congress hated it. More Republicans voted, to show anger about this than anyone would have expected, including Republican members of the Senate Banking Committee. I mean, things that matter in this oversight world. And I think a number of people, there is a broader, more important discussion to have about the way in which learnings from that instance will inform the way sanctions are imposed in the future. But that is a really important point to have noted. On Helms-Burton, goodness, who would have, I think in general, it's important to think about reparations, and I'm a big believer that there's no, as a general matter, it shouldn't run out a conversation. There's no timeline after which it's not important to talk about this issue. But as a legal matter, what's going on now, where we could be looking at a bunch of European, because of the permission that has been given by this administration to have a bunch of, say, European hotel chains and resort companies that sued basically possibly into insolvency. I don't, you know, the claims are enormous depending on what gets allowed here in the final instance, because of seeking reparations from seized property, et cetera. This is concerning, but I think it has this is just the beginning, and you're asking a question that I think more people will focus on if and when we get further down this road, and after which point people may make business decisions, business development decisions about exposure to the United States. But right now that hasn't sifted into a calculus in the way that it has, for example, when it comes to how people are thinking about in the trade conversation, as people are thinking about changing their supply chains or their trading relationships based on the fact that the United States has rearranged its priorities with regard to TPP and trade in Asia and et cetera. So I think that that conversation is just beginning. I expect it will have some effect, and particularly if in that like worst case scenario, an investment fund buys all the claimant rights and could, as it did in Argentina, bankrupt a country, excuse me. So, I mean, goodness knows where this will go. I hope it's not that terrible end state.
So for on your third question, so I'm not a lawyer. My simplistic understanding is we're basically saying, you know, Iran's doing these terrible things. You can't buy oil from Iran. And any firm that either is doing the purchasing or is facilitating it through finance or insurance, you know, can be cut off from the US financial system. And I believe that's what Secretary Pompeo said very clearly in the last few days. You have to choose between doing business with Iran and doing business with the United States. And any significant firm is going to choose being connected to the United States.
I can answer that question. Basically, you're using the same, that's all right, and you're using the same legal authorities that exist. So if you make a shift and you're not using dollars, which frankly no one should be using in Iran legally anyway now. If it's seen as evasion, you can still be swept up under an evasion prong.
I think I'm going to start bundling a few questions in the interests of getting them so that our speakers and you all get a chance. First question right here, and then Robert Manning, and then Barbara Slavin.
Can I just make it's really just a point of clarification. If you have a small company in China that purchases Iranian oil, it does not touch the dollar. Sorry, a small company purchases Iranian oil, does not touch the dollar, does not have any connections with the U.S. economy whatsoever. Why can't that work? I just don't understand why that kind of transaction would be vulnerable. If you could just clarify, thanks.
It still would violate the way that it's written into NDAA and interpreted, including by precedent. So Kunlun's a good example of this, right? Which was designated and remains designated. So it's still not allowed. I think as a practical matter, they could continue to do that for as long as they're able to manage the, money value transfer and it doesn't touch. So they could live under sanctions.
But let me ask Elizabeth a question. So, I mean, if you just drive a truck from Iran to China, that's fine, but that's going to be nothing. So if you have a big tanker that normally would have insurance and other.
The Iranians insure their own tankers. They use their own tankers.
Many of which were designated and kept flowing. So I think, this is the answer to your question, which is they all just exist under sanctions. It's sort of the, becomes a community or club of the sanctions that nevertheless manage. So they'll have problems with scaling, but they can still do something.
Right here.
Elizabeth, my question is about intelligent sanctions designed to minimize consequences on the economy and business. You and Peter Harrell have argued that a couple of things should be done within the executive branch. One is to create a business advisory panel that sanctions designers can consult with in the process, and secondly, to require an economic impact statement on each one of these sanctions that's put forward. I'd just like to know where you think those proposals stand and if they have a chance to move forward. Thank you.
No, just go ahead.
I'm still sticking by them. I don't think they have much traction, but I have noticed that other people have run with these ideas and don't credit me, but that's fine. That's good.
I always credit you.
Thank you. No, you don't need to. In fact, it may be great if lots of people who believe in this idea talk about it. But think of all the agencies in our administration that have outside advisory boards, and many of them are actually useful and for a variety of reasons. And think about the economic impact statements I think agencies like our Department of Defense do when they're thinking about certain campaigns or the use of particular set of a unit of military, a kind of munitions, et cetera. There's various ways in which those evaluations are done for other policies, and I think it would be incredibly useful to suggest a kind of professionalization, institutionalization, and economic impact assessment for what has become a prominent, essential element of our national security and foreign policy.
Robert Manning.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on some of Dick Bert's comments. I mean, there's no question we have power. It's become a second instrument. Nobody will challenge the U.S. military, and nobody can challenge the U.S. dollar. And the problem, one of the problems I see is it's become the equivalent of if you have a hammer, every problem's a nail. And there's an element of feel good to sanctions. Congress loves it because it's a do somethingism response, even though it may have no consequence. In the case of Russia, it has not changed their behavior. When I talk to my Russian friends and ask them what the impact is, they tell me things like, well, we have to go to Belarus to buy salmon. The other thing that troubles me, besides the Congress codifying it, I wonder what the longer term unintended consequences are going to be if you look at global trends in the world and where, if you think the U.S. can be a superpower forever and maintain primacy everywhere, then everything's fine. If you think the world's moving in another direction and this is just going to generate that much more resentment and coalitions against us, that may be something to worry about.
I have some thoughts on that, which I wrote into a report, which we're releasing next Tuesday, on how economic change and financial technology change are going to change the availability and the strength of sanctions and other coercive forms of economic power. Maybe I'll just leave it at that if you're trying to get in. Let's talk offline.
David, do you?
I would just add that, I do think we're moving to a multipolar world. People don't like to face it. There's a lot of talk about the decline of the United States. I don't see the U.S. declining, but the developing world is rising, and we're going to be a smaller share of global GDP and global just about everything. And so if we want cooperation on climate and public health and other issues, then I'm sympathetic to the idea that we're eroding some of our soft capital that we can use to mobilize countries for, and as people are suggesting, probably not for much success, just using the financial sanctions against everything.
I mean, the counter argument against this is the one that sort of percolated right before the second Iraq War, which was the idea that take advantage of your power while you still have it. And it didn't work out so well in 2003, but I think there is the idea still that, Trump is clearly flexing the muscles that Obama was not always willing to flex. So I'll leave it at that because we have a bunch more questions. One from David Pollock, and then I'll get to them.
Yeah, thanks very much. I want to just focus quite narrowly on what is the effect of our unilateral sanctions against Iran likely to be. You've both made, I think, as I understood it, a compelling case that even though they are unilateral, that other countries will grudgingly. The question is, so what? How much is it going to hurt the Iranian economy? And more important, what is Iran likely to do? And how long is it going to take for this to have, in your view, an effect roughly analogous to what happened with the JCPOA, which is bringing Iran to the negotiating table in a relatively meaningful way?
I've been thinking about this a lot since Sunday night. I think most big importers of Iranian oil will kick and scream, negotiate, and then comply mostly into the first month, so and through May. They won't, not all of them will get to zero. China will have some difficulty substituting all of those barrels, as will India and Turkey, just as a logistics matter. Had the US administration made this decision even 2 weeks, or made this announcement 2 weeks earlier, the way that booking crude cargoes goes, it would have made it much more likely that the administration could achieve success. But because at this point in the month, cargoes are pretty much booked for May, there's a huge scramble to try and find alternatives or draw from storage, which is one of the reasons why the prices responded in the way that they did. And you heard people talk about the market being ambushed and such, which is true if you're in the trading community and you're thinking about the deadlines that come in a particular month for a prompt month cargo. But I think what will then happen through May and June is a transition to a different set of players that are purchasing Iranian oil to become more like what Barbara was discussing, smaller traders, smaller importers, smaller financial institutions who don't care, and some who are just not aware of what their compliance obligations are should they want to be legal US sanctions. So I don't think there'll ever be a get to zero. I think that the administration will have a triumph in their policy in May, and they will let the world know. And then after that, it will get pretty messy, but there will be a strong level of compliance. To your broader, from those biggest players, to your broader question about, well, what then happens? How long can Iran manage? So I think I expect that their exports will reduce by more than, go below 50% of what they are now. I think they'll go below 500,000, maybe like 250, 350, something in there, I would say, in that initial tightening, and then it'll sort of get a little fuzzy thereafter. We're gonna have all the usual problems counting when we're not sure if the title to the cargo has traded hands or not. And the price will moderate. Saudi and the UAE will, as they said they will, supply some alternatives. Because they also don't want $100 oil. I think they could probably live with, oil in the 80s just fine. And U.S. production is not only mismatched, but it also isn't spare capacity, so it's not going to come on immediately. But the price will moderate out again. And so will Iran suffer through in that environment? And people there are probably even here some people who are close Iran watchers who would have comments about how long they can hang in there in a resistance economy. But I would think that the priority would be absolutely as long as possible, hoping that Trump will be unseated in the next general.
I think we have our final question right here. Mr. Hugo.
Thank you. I'm from Chinese Embassy. Frankly, I'm a little surprised that today's theme is U.S. financial power, Europe and China, but China has been such a hot word. So I'd like to give a little personal remarks. First is about the dominance of U.S. financial system. When we attended the spring meetings of IMF and World Bank, there is a theme about the 75th anniversary of Bretton Woods. We see that the international financial system has been witnessed such great transformation. So how can we think about the dominance of financial system? What will be the future? Is it everlasting, or it is undergoing some changes? The second is about how to think the success of sanction. We think sanction is just an approach or a purpose. So we may see that South Africa, DPRK, there are some successful cases for sanctions, but I think all of the successful cases are based on the United Nations, the multilateral framework, not only the unilateral approach. So the third is about China's participation. I'm gonna try to make it brief. That of course, you have many remarks about China's policy. I think the core of China's policy is based on the multilateral world system, the world order based on the rules. So, including the Belt and Road Forum, there are I think there are several decades countries and there's a high level delegation there. We think that if we can get more multilateral consensus, that will be beneficial to get something positive instead of only the negative approach. Maybe especially we think the long arm sanction that is not accepted by most of the world's countries. So how to balance unilateralism and multilateralism, how to respect the international justice. We think we need so much to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was more of a comment.
Okay. Final question here.
Hi, I'm Nia Yoza from Defense Priorities. So you guys both said it's unlikely there will be a truly credible alternative payment system, or I guess global financial architecture. But if someone pulls that off, the black swan happens. Can you lay out for us what that means for the United States, other than just we can't use sanctions effectively anymore? What does it mean for our economy, our financial prosperity, etc.?
Yeah. So thinking about such a scenario, I think a key issue is whether the U.S. has maintained, a very strong and deep financial system, and then somehow someone else has built something, kind of equivalently strong and open, et cetera. And I think there's probably some instability from having two dominant currencies in the world, and there is a literature on that. But probably there's not that much we can do about it. The other scenario where, we facilitate the rise of an alternative currency because we do a bad job with rule of law. I didn't even mention fiscal management. I'm not terribly worried about the short run, but in the longer run, we've got really serious fiscal problems, a risk of, secular decline in the value of the dollar. I think we have a lot of things to worry about. And if we go down that poor economic path, then I think we'll be moving into a world where, as Elizabeth just said, the lack of sanctions power will be our least worry.
Anything to add? Well, I'd like to thank Elizabeth and David for their excellent presentations.
Thank you for moderating.
Thanks. That was good.